All right, welcome back to ABA Exam Review and the continuation of our 6th edition BCBA task list series. Today we're continuing concepts and principles with B.19, identify and distinguish among verbal operants. At first, this is a topic that can be overwhelming and intimidating, but I think once you get to the point where you're ready to sit for the exam, verbal operants can become very, very easy, very, very second nature, and questions that you should be able to answer with relative ease on your exam. As always, we're going to break down each operant into what we believe are digestible and easy ways to think about the operants and to explain the operants. Be sure to subscribe if you are not already. Check out behavior-analytic.com for all of our study materials. When you pass your exam, please let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shoutout. Work hard, study hard, let's get going. So verbal operants are the building blocks of communication as defined by B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner's verbal behavior is where he went through and viewed verbal behavior through the lens of behaviorism, radical behaviorism, and in our case, ABA. Each operant is functionally distinct, and that word functionally is important. In ABA, when we're thinking about verbal behavior, we're thinking about a speaker and a listener, and we're focusing on function, not form. As with most behaviors in ABA, if not all, what's more important is why the behavior is happening. What's less important is that topography or form. Now, verbal behavior is reinforced through the actions of another person, so speaker and listener. Once the speaker says something, if the listener responds, that listener becomes the speaker, and vice versa. And then operants are defined by what evokes and reinforces them, as well as do they have point-to-point, and is there formal similarity. Let's start with maybe the most common one, or at least amongst RBTs or newer technicians. Now, as the analyst, of course, you're going to know all of these. But when we think about mands, we think about request. We always think about man training or getting the client to ask or use functional communication. Now, when we think about mands, again, we're thinking about request. Hand me that cookie. I want something to eat. I want to play. What is your name? All of these things are acting as these mands where we're requesting items or actions or information. When we're thinking about verbal operants, we want to go in kind of a checklist. First, what is the operant evoked by? In the case of mands, it's evoked by a motivating operation. Then you ask, well, what is it reinforced by? In the case of mands, it's going to be the requested item or action. So if you are mand training, and this is where this becomes important, because if you're asked about training a verbal operant, or if you're in practice training a verbal operant, you want to remember what you're using for reinforcement. If you're trying to train mands, you want to reinforce the mand with whatever was requested. So if the request is an item, give the item. If it's an action, give the action. Mands directly benefit the speaker, and it's the only operant controlled by a motivating operation. So relatively easy to remember. For example, child is thirsty, should say thirsty. That's the motivating operation, right? The child says juice, child receives juice. So we're evoked by deprivation. The behavior is reinforced by the reception of the requested item. Tacts. Tacts are labels. Again, pretty easy to remember, pretty easy to define. Now, what makes this, like man's easy, is tacts are evoked by a nonverbal stimulus. So it's relatively easy to remember. These are just labels, right? So you see an object, you hear something, you label it. If I see a TV, I label a TV. I hear a bird, I say bird. Now, what reinforces tacts? Generalized reinforcement. Praise, attention, tokens, money. We're not asking for things with the tacts. Now, there are more advanced operants we might talk about later, but we're focused on the basics here. I always start with the basics. People skip the basics because they want to believe they're too simple. They try to rush to complicated things, and then the basics are what gets them on the exam. Until you are 100% fluent on every single item on that task list, the basics, focus on that only and don't try to complicate things. Now, When we're tacting, we are labeling. We're not making requests. We're not necessarily making conversations. We're not repeating. We're just labeling. You're driving down the road. You see a field of horses. You say horse. That's a label. If you are responding to someone, if someone says, "What's in your hand?" and you say a pencil, that is not a tact. So we're helping build expressive language by labeling nonverbal stimuli. We're controlled by what is physically present, not necessarily verbal behavior. For example, child sees juice, nonverbal, just a box of juice, a carton of juice, whatever it may be. Child says juice, adult says, yes, that is juice. The child has been reinforced through praise or attention or generalized reinforcement. Moving on, echoics, vocal imitation. We are echoing what is being said. I say, "What's your name?" You say, "What's your name?" That is an echoic. Now, it's evoked by a verbal stimulus with point-to-point correspondence. What does point-to-point mean? Point-to-point means identical in what is being verbalized or vocalized. Okay, so we're talking about point-to-point. If I write my name, Alex, and you write Alex, we have point-to-point. What is formal similarity? Formal similarity is how the message is being conveyed. If I write and you write, form is the same. If I write and you say, form is different. So point to point is the message, is it the same? Formal similarity is how the message is being delivered. Is it the same? So it's reinforced by generalized reinforcement. Critical for language development, and it's used in manned and tact training. For example, adult says juice, child says juice, adult says good. So it was evoked by juice. We now have point to point. The message is exactly the same. The child says, adult says, the form is the same. Therefore, it's an echoic. Intraverbals, conversations, answering questions, responding to messages, right? Evoked by a verbal stimulus without point to point. And that's what's going to separate it from an echoic. If I say, "What's my name?" you say, "What's my name?" point to point, it's not an intraverbal. That's an echoic. Very important. Reinforced by generalized reinforcement, often social continued conversation. This can help build social skills and encourages flexible language use. Think about if you're working with a child and you say, "Name 3 animals." They say monkey, tiger, lion. You say, "Name 3 more animals." And we're trying to get them to name 3 different animals, bird, cat, lion, right? Whatever it may be. We're encouraging flexible language use by trying to reduce echoics and simple requests into more conversational objects or conversations or verbal operants, I should say. Now, notice how we don't say formal similarity because the key here is no point to point. It's a conversation. We are responding. So adult says, "What do you drink?" It's evoked. The child saying juice, so evoked by the verbal stimulus. This is our verbal SD. Child says juice. Adult says, "I'll get you some." If the adult would have said, "What do you drink?" and the child said, "What do you drink?" that's an echoic. Remember, we're looking for that point to point. Okay, the next 2, textuals and transcriptions, a little less used in our day-to-day, still important. Textuals are reading aloud, so we're reading. It's evoked by a written verbal stimulus, reinforced by generalized reinforcement. We're reading written words, pretty straightforward, right? Point to point, because you're reading the passage or what's written, but there's no formal similarity because written and read are not the same, right? So there's no formal similarity. An example, child sees juice written on the menu. Child says juice. Written and says is not the same form. It is point to point. Those are equal. Transcriptions, writing or spelling spoken words. So think about somebody in court taking transcription. You're taking notes in class. It's evoked by a spoken verbal stimulus, reinforced by generalized reinforcement. You're dictating or writing what is heard. There is point to point, but there's no formal similarity. Why? Because spoken versus writing is not the same. The adult says juice. Child writes juice on his paper. The child has transcribed what the adult said. Finally, autoclitics. Definitely a more complicated topic, so we're going to keep it very, very simple. Autoclitics modify your verbal behavior. It's evoked by the speaker's own verbal behavior and conditions surrounding that verbal behavior. So whatever your environmental conditions are reflecting onto your own verbal behavior, these are autoclitics, because we don't speak in 1 or 2 word phrases. We speak in sentences and longer phrases where we're modifying our verbal behavior based on what we see, what we feel, what we think, our emotions. Now, this changes how the listener is going to interpret your man, your tact, etc. If I'm sitting here, or the child says, I think that's juice, instead of that's juice, well, that's going to change how you interpret this phrase. I think that's versus that is indicates certainty versus uncertainty. So the autoclitic modifies basic operants with emotion, grammar, feelings, and thoughts. And that's why it's important to listen to those autoclitics, because it's going to give you more insight into how that person is using their verbal behavior. Let's finish with the table. Let's start with the man. It's evoked by a motivating operation, the only one, reinforced by the specific reinforcer. Example, say juice. When thirsty, get juice. Tact, evoked by nonverbal stimulus, reinforced by generalized social reinforcement. We label a toy as a car. Echoic, evoked by verbal stimulus with point-to-point, reinforced by generalized reinforcement. Repeat juice after model. Intraverbal, verbal stimulus, no point-to-point, social reinforcement. Answer juice to the question, what do you drink? Textual, evoked by written stimulus, reinforced by social reinforcement. Reread juice. Transcription, spoken stimulus, social reinforcement. You transcribe or dictate juice after hearing it. And then autoclitic, evoked by context, verbal behavior. We say, I think before a tact. I think, I feel, it might, etc. That's it. That's verbal operants. Again, intimidating at first, right? Kind of like experimental design. At first, it's intimidating because it's brand new material that in your classes and stuff you probably are familiar with, but until we start really digging in and applying, it's quite challenging. So don't become overwhelmed. Keep it that simple. Like I said, until you're 100% fluent in the task list on just the simple ideas, we're not trying to get more complex. 100% fluency in simple ideas is often good enough to get you to where you want to be, which is to pass the exam. Thanks for watching. Check out behavior-analytic-study.com. Make sure you subscribe. When you pass, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout-out. Work hard, study hard. See you soon.